Chapter VII. The Jupiter. Though Eleanor Harding rode off from John Bold on a high horse, it must not be supposed that her heart was so elate as her demeanour. In the first place, she had a natural repugnance to losing her lover, and in the next, she was not quite so sure that she was in the right as she pretended to be. Her father had told her, and that now repeatedly, that Bold was doing nothing unjust or ungenerous, and why then should she rebuke him and throw him off, when she felt herself so ill able to bear his loss? But such is human nature, and young lady nature especially. As she walked off from him beneath the shady elms of the close, her look, her tone, every motion and gesture of her body belied her heart. She would have given the world to have taken him by the hand, to have reasoned with him, persuaded him, cajoled him, coaxed him out of his project, to have overcome him with all her female artillery, and to have redeemed her father at the cost of herself. But pride would not let her do this, and she left him without a look of love or a word of kindness. Had Bold been judging of another lover and of another lady, he might have understood all this as well as we do; but in matters of love men do not see clearly in their own affairs. They say that faint heart never won fair lady, and it is amazing to me how fair ladies are won, so faint are often men's hearts, were it not for the kindness of their nature, that, seeing the weakness of our courage, they will occasionally descend from their impregnable fortresses, and themselves aid us in effecting their own defeat. Too often would they escape unconquered, if not unscathed, and free of body, if not of heart. Poor Bold crept off quite crestfallen. He felt that as regarded Eleanor Harding his fate was sealed, unless he could consent to give up a task to which he had pledged himself, and which indeed it would not be easy for him to give up. Lawyers were engaged, and the question had, to a certain extent, been taken up by the public. Besides, how could a high-spirited girl like Eleanor Harding really learn to love a man for neglecting a duty which he assumed? Could she allow her affection to be purchased at the cost of his own self-respect? As regarded the issue of his attempt at reformation in the hospital, Bold had no reason hitherto to be discontented with his success. All Barchester was by the ears about it. The bishop, the archdeacon, the warden, the steward, and several other clerical allies had daily meetings, discussing their tactics, and preparing for the great attack. Sir Abraham Haphazard had been consulted, but his opinion was not yet received. Copies of Hiram's will, copies of Warden's journals, copies of leases, copies of accounts, copies of everything that could be copied, and of some that could not, had been sent to him, and the case was assuming most creditable dimensions. But above all, it had been mentioned in the Daily Jupiter. That all-powerful organ of the press, in one of its leading thunderbolts launched at St. Cross, had thus remarked: "Another case, of smaller dimensions indeed, but of similar import, is now likely to come under public notice. We are informed that the warden or master of an old almshouse attached to Barchester Cathedral is in receipt of 25 times the annual income appointed for him by the will of the founder, while the sum yearly expended on the absolute purposes of the charity has always remained fixed. In other words, the legatees under the founder's will have received no advantage from the increase in the value of the property during the last 4 centuries, such increase having been absorbed by the so-called warden. It is impossible to conceive a case of greater injustice. It is no answer to say that some 6 or 9 or 12 old men receive as much of the goods of this world as such old men require. On what foundation, moral or divine, traditional or legal, is grounded the warden's claim to the large income he receives for doing nothing? The contentment of these almsmen, if content they be, can give him no title to this wealth. Does he ever ask himself, when he stretches wide his clerical palm to receive the pay of some dozen of the working clergy, for what service he is so remunerated? Does his conscience ever entertain the question of his right to such subsidies? Or is it possible that the subject never so presents itself to his mind that he has received for many years, and intends, should God spare him, to receive for years to come, these fruits of the industrious piety of past ages, indifferent as to any right on his own part, or of any injustice to others? We must express an opinion that nowhere but in the Church of England, and only there among its priests, could such a state of moral indifference be found. I must, for the present, leave my readers to imagine the state of Mr Harding's mind after reading the above article. They say that 40,000 copies of the Jupiter are daily sold, and that each copy is read by 5 persons at the least. 200,000 readers, then, would hear this accusation against him. 200,000 hearts would swell with indignation at the griping injustice, the barefaced robbery of the warden of Barchester Hospital. And how was he to answer this? How was he to open his inmost heart to this multitude, to these thousands, the educated, the polished, the picked men of his own country? How show them that he was no robber, no avaricious, lazy priest scrambling for gold, but a retiring, humble-spirited man, who had innocently taken what had innocently been offered to him? "Write to the Jupiter," suggested the bishop. "Yes," said the archdeacon, more worldly wise than his father. "Yes, and be smothered with ridicule, tossed over and over again with scorn, shaken this way and that as a rat in the mouth of a practised terrier. You will leave out some word or letter in your answer, and the ignorance of the cathedral clergy will be harped upon. You will make some small mistake, which will be a falsehood, or some admission which will be self-condemnation. You will find yourself to have been vulgar, ill-tempered, irreverent, and illiterate, and the chances are 10 to 1 that, being a clergyman, you will have been guilty of blasphemy. A man may have the best of causes, the best of talents, and the best of tempers. He may write as well as Addison, or as strongly as Junius, but even with all this he cannot successfully answer when attacked by the Jupiter. In such matters it is omnipotent. What the Tsar is in Russia, or the mob in America, that the Jupiter is in England. Answer such an article? No, warden. Whatever you do, don't do that. We were to look for this sort of thing, you know, but we need not draw down on our heads more of it than is necessary." The article in the Jupiter, while it so greatly harassed our poor warden, was an immense triumph to some of the opposite party. Sorry as Bold was to see Mr Harding attacked so personally, it still gave him a feeling of elation to find his cause taken up by so powerful an advocate; and as to Finney, the attorney, he was beside himself. What, to be engaged in the same cause, and on the same side with the Jupiter, to have the views he had recommended seconded and furthered and battled for by the Jupiter, perhaps to have his own name mentioned as that of the learned gentleman whose efforts had been so successful on behalf of the poor of Barchester. He might be examined before committees of the House of Commons, with heaven knows how much a day for his personal expenses. He might be engaged for years on such a suit. There was no end to the glorious golden dreams which this leader in the Jupiter produced in the soaring mind of Finney. And the old bedesmen, they also heard of this article, and had a glimmering, indistinct idea of the marvellous advocate which had now taken up their cause. Abel Handy limped hither and thither through the rooms, repeating all that he understood to have been printed, with some additions of his own which he thought should have been added. He told them how the Jupiter had declared that their warden was no better than a robber, and that what the Jupiter said was acknowledged by the world to be true; how the Jupiter had affirmed that each one of them, each one of us, Jonathan Crumple, think of that, had a clear right to 100 a year, and that if the Jupiter had said so, it was better than a decision of the Lord Chancellor. And then he carried about the paper supplied by Mr. Finney, which, though none of them could read it, still afforded in its very touch and aspect positive corroboration of what was told them. And Jonathan Crumple pondered deeply over his returning wealth, and Job Sculpit saw how right he had been in signing the petition, and said so many scores of times, and Spriggs leered fearfully with his one eye, and Moody, as he more nearly approached the coming golden age, hated more deeply than ever those who still kept possession of what he so coveted. Even Billy Gazy and poor bedridden Bell became active and uneasy, and the great Bunce stood apart with lowering brow, with deep grief seated in his heart, for he perceived that evil days were coming. It had been decided, the archdeacon advising, that no remonstrance, explanation, or defence should be addressed from the Barchester conclave to the editor of the Jupiter; but hitherto that was the only decision to which they had come. Sir Abraham Haphazard was deeply engaged in preparing a bill for the mortification of papists, to be called the Convent Custody Bill, the purport of which was to enable any Protestant clergyman over 50 years of age to search any nun whom he suspected of being in possession of treasonable papers or Jesuitical symbols; and as there were to be 137 clauses in the bill, each clause containing a separate thorn for the side of the papist, and as it was known the bill would be fought inch by 50 maddened Irishmen, the due construction and adequate dovetailing of it did consume much of Sir Abraham's time. The bill had all its desired effect. Of course it never passed into law, but it so completely divided the ranks of the Irish members, who had bound themselves together to force on the ministry a bill for compelling all men to drink Irish whiskey, and all women to wear Irish poplins, that for the remainder of the session the great Poplin and Whiskey League was utterly harmless. Thus it happened that Sir Abraham's opinion was not at once forthcoming, and the uncertainty, the expectation, and suffering of the folk of Barchester was maintained at a high pitch. Chapter 8 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 8. Plumstead Episcopi. The reader must now be requested to visit the rectory of Plumstead Episcopi, and as it is as yet still early morning, to ascend again with us into the bedroom of the archdeacon. The mistress of the mansion was at her toilet, on which we will not dwell with profane eyes, but proceed into a small inner room where the doctor dressed and kept his boots and sermons, and here we will take our stand, premising that the door of the room was so open as to admit of a conversation between our Reverend Adam and his valued Eve. "It's all your own fault, archdeacon," said the latter. "I told you from the beginning how it would end, and papa has no one to thank but you." "Good gracious, my dear!" said the doctor, appearing at the door of his dressing room, with his face and head enveloped in the rough towel which he was violently using. "How can you say so? I am doing my very best." "I wish you had never done so much," said the lady, interrupting him. "If you'd just have let John Bold come and go there, as he and papa liked, he and Eleanor would have been married by this time, and we should not have heard one word about all this affair." "But, my dear—" "Oh, it's all very well, archdeacon, and of course you're right. I don't for a moment think you'll ever admit that you could be wrong. But the fact is, you've brought this young man down upon papa by huffing him as you have done." "But, my love—" "And all because you didn't like John Bold for a brother-in-law. How is she ever to do better? Papa hasn't got a shilling, and though Eleanor is well enough, she has not at all a taking style of beauty. I'm sure I don't know how she's to do better than marry John Bold, or as well indeed," added the anxious sister, giving the last twist to her last shoestring. Dr Grantly felt keenly the injustice of this attack, but what could he say? He certainly had huffed John Bold. "He certainly had objected to him as a brother-in-law, and a very few months ago the very idea had excited his wrath. But now matters were changed. John Bold had shown his power, and though he was as odious as ever to the archdeacon, power is always respected, and the reverend dignitary began to think that such an alliance might not have been imprudent. Nevertheless, his motto was still no surrender. He would still fight it out. He believed confidently in Oxford, in the bench of bishops, in Sir Abraham Haphazard, and in himself. And it was only when alone with his wife that doubts of defeat ever beset him. He once more tried to communicate this confidence to Mrs Grantly, and for the 20th time began to tell her of Sir Abraham. "Oh, Sir Abraham," said she, collecting all her house keys into her basket before she descended, "Sir Abraham won't get Eleanor a husband. Sir Abraham won't get papa another income when he has been worreted out of the hospital. Mark what I tell you, archdeacon. While you and Sir Abraham are fighting, papa will lose his preferment; and what will you do then with him and Eleanor on your hands? Besides, who's to pay Sir Abraham? I suppose he won't take the case up for nothing." And so the lady descended to family worship among her children and servants, the pattern of a good and prudent wife. Dr Grantly was blessed with a happy, thriving family. There were first 3 boys, now at home from school for the holidays. They were called respectively Charles James, Henry, and Samuel. The 2 younger, there were 5 in all, were girls. The elder, Florinda, bore the name of the Archbishop of York's wife, whose godchild she was, and the younger had been christened Grizzel, after a sister of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The boys were all clever, and gave good promise of being well able to meet the cares and trials of the world; and yet they were not alike in their dispositions, and each had his individual character, and each his separate admirers among the doctor's friends. Charles James was an exact and careful boy. He never committed himself. He well knew how much was expected from the eldest son of the Archdeacon of Barchester, and was therefore mindful not to mix too freely with other boys. He had not the great talents of his younger brothers, but he exceeded them in judgment and propriety of demeanour. His fault, if he had one, was an over attention to words instead of things. There was a thought too much finesse about him, and, as even his father sometimes told him, he was too fond of a compromise. The second was the archdeacon's favourite son, and Henry was indeed a brilliant boy. The versatility of his genius was surprising, and the visitors at Plumstead Episcopi were often amazed at the marvellous manner in which he would, when called on, adapt his capacity to apparently most uncongenial pursuits. He appeared once before a large circle as Luther the Reformer, and delighted them with the perfect manner in which he assumed the character, and within 3 days he again astonished them by acting the part of a Capuchin friar to the very life. For this last exploit his father gave him a golden guinea, and his brothers said the reward had been promised beforehand in the event of the performance being successful. He was also sent on a tour into Devonshire, a treat which the lad was most anxious of enjoying. His father's friends there, however, did not appreciate his talents, and sad accounts were sent home of the perversity of his nature. He was a most courageous lad, game to the backbone. It was soon known, both at home where he lived, and within some miles of Barchester Cathedral, and also at Westminster, where he was at school, that young Henry could box well, and would never own himself beat. Other boys would fight while they had a leg to stand on, but he would fight with no leg at all. Those backing him would sometimes think him crushed by the weight of blows and faint with loss of blood, and his friends would endeavour to withdraw him from the contest. But no, Henry never gave in, was never weary of the battle. The ring was the only element in which he seemed to enjoy himself, and while other boys were happy in the number of their friends, he rejoiced most in the multitude of his foes. His relations could not but admire his pluck, but they sometimes were forced to regret that he was inclined to be a bully, and those not so partial to him as his father was, observed with pain that though he could fawn to the masters and the archdeacon's friends, he was imperious and masterful to the servants and the poor. But perhaps Samuel was the general favourite, and dear little Soapy, as he was familiarly called, was as engaging a child as ever fond mother petted. He was soft and gentle in his manners, and attractive in his speech. The tone of his voice was melody, and every action was a grace. Unlike his brothers, he was courteous to all. He was affable to the lowly, and meek even to the very scullery maid. He was a boy of great promise, minding his books, and delighting the hearts of his masters. His brothers, however, were not particularly fond of him. They would complain to their mother that Soapy's civility all meant something. They thought that his voice was too often listened to at Plumstead Episcopi, and evidently feared that as he grew up he would have more weight in the house than either of them. There was therefore a sort of agreement among them to put young Soapy down. This, however, was not so easy to be done. Samuel, though young, was sharp. He could not assume the stiff decorum of Charles James, nor could he fight like Henry, but he was a perfect master of his own weapons, and contrived, in the teeth of both of them, to hold the place which he had assumed. Henry declared that he was a false, cunning creature, and Charles James, though he always spoke of him as his dear brother Samuel, was not slow to say a word against him when opportunity offered. To speak the truth, Samuel was a cunning boy, and those even who loved him best could not but own that, for one so young, he was too adroit in choosing his words, and too skilled in modulating his voice. The two little girls, Florinda and Grizzel, were nice little girls enough, but they did not possess the strong sterling qualities of their brothers. Their voices were not often heard at Plumstead Episcopi. They were bashful and timid by nature, slow to speak before company, even when asked to do so, and though they looked very nice in their clean white muslin frocks and pink sashes, they were but little noticed by the archdeacon's visitors. Whatever of submissive humility may have appeared in the gait and visage of the archdeacon during his colloquy with his wife in the sanctum of their dressing rooms, was dispelled as he entered his breakfast parlour with erect head and powerful step. In the presence of a third person he assumed the lord and master, and that wise and talented lady too well knew the man to whom her lot for life was bound to stretch her authority beyond the point at which it would be borne. Strangers at Plumstead Episcopi, when they saw the imperious brow with which he commanded silence from the large circle of visitors, children, and servants, who came together in the morning to hear him read the word of God, and watched how meekly that wife seated herself behind her basket of keys, with a little girl on each side, as she caught that commanding glance. Strangers, I say, seeing this, could little guess that some 15 minutes since she had stoutly held her ground against him, hardly allowing him to open his mouth in his own defence. But such is the tact and talent of women. And now let us observe the well-furnished breakfast parlour at Plumstead Episcopi, and the comfortable air of all the belongings of the rectory. Comfortable they certainly were, but neither gorgeous nor even grand. Indeed, considering the money that had been spent there, the eye and taste might have been better served. There was an air of heaviness about the rooms, which might have been avoided without any sacrifice of propriety. Colours might have been better chosen, and lights more perfectly diffused, but perhaps in doing so the thorough clerical aspect of the whole might have been somewhat marred. At any rate, it was not without ample consideration that those thick, dark, costly carpets were put down, those embossed but sombre papers hung up, those heavy curtains draped so as to half exclude the light of the sun; nor were these old-fashioned chairs, bought at a price far exceeding that now given for more modern goods, without a purpose. The breakfast service on the table was equally costly and equally plain. The apparent object had been to spend money without obtaining brilliancy or splendour. The urn was of thick and solid silver, as were also the teapot, coffee pot, cream ewer, and sugar bowl. The cups were old, dim dragon china, worth about £1 apiece, but very despicable in the eyes of the uninitiated. The silver forks were so heavy as to be disagreeable to the hand, and the bread basket was of a weight really formidable to any but robust persons. The tea consumed was the very best, the coffee the very blackest, the cream the very thickest. There was dry toast and buttered toast, muffins and crumpets, hot bread and cold bread, white bread and brown bread, home-made bread and baker's bread, wheaten bread and oaten bread, and if there be other breads than these, they were there. There were eggs in napkins, and crispy bits of bacon under silver covers, and there were little fishes in a little box, and devilled kidneys frizzling on a hot water dish, which by the by were placed closely contiguous to the plate of the worthy archdeacon himself. Over and above this, on a snow white napkin, spread upon the sideboard, was a huge ham and a huge sirloin, the latter having laden the dinner table on the previous evening. Such was the ordinary fare at Plumstead Episcopi. And yet I have never found the rectory a pleasant house. The fact that man shall not live by bread alone seemed to be somewhat forgotten, and noble as was the appearance of the host, and sweet and good-natured as was the face of the hostess, talented as were the children, and excellent as were the viands and the wines, in spite of these attractions, I generally found the rectory somewhat dull. After breakfast the archdeacon would retire, of course to his clerical pursuits. Mrs Grantly, I presume, inspected her kitchen, though she had a first-rate housekeeper with £60 a year, and attended to the lessons of Florinda and Grizzel, though she had an excellent governess with £30 a year; but at any rate she disappeared, and I never could make companions of the boys. Charles James, though he always looked as though there was something in him, never seemed to have much to say, and what he did say he would always unsay the next minute. He told me once that he considered cricket on the whole to be a gentlemanlike game for boys, provided they would play without running about, and that fives also was a seemly game, so that those who played it never heated themselves. Henry once quarrelled with me for taking his sister Grizel's part in a contest between them as to the best mode of using a watering pot for the garden flowers, and from that day to this he has not spoken to me, though he speaks at me often enough. For half an hour or so I certainly did like Sammy's gentle speeches, but one gets tired of honey, and I found that he preferred the more admiring listeners whom he met in the kitchen garden and back precincts of the establishment. Besides, I think I once caught Sammy fibbing. On the whole, therefore, I found the rectory a dull house, though it must be admitted that everything there was of the very best. After breakfast, on the morning of which we are writing, the archdeacon, as usual, retired to his study, intimating that he was going to be very busy, but that he would see Mr Chadwick if he called. On entering this sacred room, he carefully opened the paper case on which he was wont to compose his favourite sermons, and spread on it a fair sheet of paper, and one partly written on. He then placed his inkstand, looked at his pen, and folded his blotting paper. Having done so, he got up again from his seat, stood with his back to the fireplace, and yawned comfortably, stretching out vastly his huge arms and opening his burly chest. He then walked across the room and locked the door, and having so prepared himself, he threw himself into his easy chair, took from a secret drawer beneath his table a volume of Rabelais, and began to amuse himself with the witty mischief of Panurge, and so passed the archdeacon's morning on that day. He was left undisturbed at his studies for an hour or two, when a knock came to the door, and Mr Chadwick was announced. Rabelais retired into the secret drawer. The easy chair seemed knowingly to betake itself off, and when the archdeacon quickly undid his bolt, he was discovered by the steward working as usual for that church of which he was so useful a pillar. Mr Chadwick had just come from London, and was therefore known to be the bearer of important news. "We've got Sir Abraham's opinion at last," said Mr Chadwick, as he seated himself. "Well, well, well!" exclaimed the archdeacon impatiently. "Oh, it's as long as my arm," said the other. "It can't be told in a word, but you can read it." And he handed him a copy, in heaven knows how many spun out folios, of the opinion which the attorney general had managed to cram on the back and sides of the case as originally submitted to him. "The upshot is," said Chadwick, "that there's a screw loose in their case, and we had better do nothing. They are proceeding against Mr Harding and myself, and Sir Abraham holds that, under the wording of the will, and subsequent arrangements legally sanctioned, Mr Harding and I are only paid servants. The defendants should have been either the corporation of Barchester, or possibly the chapter of your father." "Ooh!" said the archdeacon. "So Master Bold is on the wrong scent, is he?" "That's Sir Abraham's opinion; but any scent almost would be a wrong scent. Sir Abraham thinks that if they'd taken the corporation or the chapter, we could have baffled them. The bishop, he thinks, would be the surest shot; but even there we could plead that the bishop is only a visitor, and that he has never made himself a consenting party to the performance of other duties." "That's quite clear," said the archdeacon. "Not quite so clear," said the other. "You see, the will says, 'My lord the bishop being graciously pleased to see that due justice be done.' Now, it may be a question whether, in accepting and administering the patronage, your father has not accepted also the other duties assigned. It is doubtful, however; but even if they hit that nail, and they are far off from that yet, the point is so nice, as Sir Abraham says, that you would force them into £15,000 cast before they could bring it to an issue, and where's that sum of money to come from?" The archdeacon rubbed his hands with delight. He had never doubted the justice of his case, but he had begun to have some dread of unjust success on the part of his enemies. It was delightful to him thus to hear that their cause was surrounded with such rocks and shoals, such causes of shipwreck unseen by the landsman's eye, but visible enough to the keen eyes of practical law mariners. How wrong his wife was to wish that Bold should marry Eleanor. Bold! Why, if he should be ass enough to persevere, he would be a beggar before he knew whom he was at law with. That's excellent, Chadwick, that's excellent. I told you Sir Abraham was the man for us." And he put down on the table the copy of the opinion, and patted it fondly. "Don't you let that be seen, though, archdeacon." "Who? I? Not for worlds," said the doctor. "People will talk, you know, archdeacon." Of course," said the doctor. "Because if that gets abroad, it would teach them how to fight their own battle." "Quite true," said the doctor. "No one here in Barchester ought to see that but you and I, archdeacon." No, certainly no one else," said the archdeacon, pleased with the closeness of the confidence. "No one else shall." "Mrs Grantly is very interested in the matter, I know," said Mr Chadwick. Did the archdeacon wink, or did he not? I am inclined to think he did not quite wink, but that without such perhaps unseemly gesture he communicated to Mr Chadwick, with the corner of his eye, intimation that, deep as was Mrs Grantly's interest in the matter, it should not procure for her a perusal of that document; and at the same time he partly opened the small drawer above spoken of, deposited the paper on the volume of Rabelais, and showed to Mr Chadwick the nature of the key which guarded these hidden treasures. The careful steward then expressed himself contented. Ah, vain man! He could fasten up his Rabelais and other things secret with all the skill of Bramah or of Chubb, but where could he fasten up the key which solved these mechanical mysteries? It is probable to us that the contents of no drawer in that house were unknown to its mistress, and we think, moreover, that she was entitled to all such knowledge. "But," said Mr Chadwick, "we must of course tell your father and Mr Harding so much of Sir Abraham's opinion as will satisfy them that the matter is doing well." "Oh, certainly; yes, of course," said the doctor. "You had better let them know that Sir Abraham is of opinion that there is no case, at any rate against Mr Harding, and that as the action is worded at present, it must fall to the ground. They must be non-suited if they carry it on. You had better tell Mr Harding that Sir Abraham is clearly of opinion that he is only a servant, and as such not liable. Or, if you like it, I'll see Mr Harding myself." "Oh, I must see him to morrow, and my father too, and I'll explain to them exactly so much. You won't go before lunch, Mr Chadwick? Well, if you will, you must, for I know your time is precious." And he shook hands with the diocesan steward and bowed him out. The archdeacon had again recourse to his drawer, and twice read through the essence of Sir Abraham Haphazard's law enlightened and law bewildered brains. It was very clear that to Sir Abraham the justice of the old men's claim, or the justice of Mr Harding's defence, were ideas that had never presented themselves. A legal victory over an opposing party was the service for which Sir Abraham was, as he imagined, to be paid, and that he, according to his lights, had diligently laboured to achieve, and with probable hope of success. Of the intense desire which Mr Harding felt to be assured on fit authority that he was wronging no man, that he was entitled in true equity to his income, that he might sleep at night without pangs of conscience, that he was no robber, no spoiler of the poor, that he and all the world might be openly convinced that he was not the man which the Jupiter had described him to be. Of such longings on the part of Mr Harding Sir Abraham was entirely ignorant, nor indeed could it be looked on as part of his business to gratify such desires. Such was not the system on which his battles were fought, and victories gained. Success was his object, and he was generally successful. He conquered his enemies by their weakness rather than by his own strength, and it had been found almost impossible to make up a case in which Sir Abraham, as an antagonist, would not find a flaw. The archdeacon was delighted with the closeness of the reasoning. To do him justice, it was not a selfish triumph that he desired. He would personally lose nothing by defeat, or at least what he might lose did not actuate him. But neither was it love of justice which made him so anxious, nor even mainly solicitude for his father-in-law. He was fighting a part of a never-ending battle against a never-conquered foe, that of the church against its enemies. He knew Mr Harding could not pay all the expense of these doings, for these long opinions of Sir Abraham's, these causes to be pleaded, these speeches to be made, these various courts through which the case was, he presumed, to be dragged. He knew that he and his father must at least bear the heavier portion of this tremendous cost; but to do the archdeacon justice, he did not recoil from this. He was a man fond of obtaining money, greedy of a large income, but open-handed enough in expending it, and it was a triumph to him to foresee the success of this measure, although he might be called on to pay so dearly for it himself. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 9 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 9. The Conference. On the following morning the archdeacon was with his father betimes, and a note was sent down to the warden begging his attendance at the palace. Dr Grantly, as he cogitated on the matter, leaning back in his brougham as he journeyed into Barchester, felt that it would be difficult to communicate his own satisfaction either to his father or his father-in-law. He wanted success on his own side, and discomfiture on that of his enemies. The bishop wanted peace on the subject, a settled peace if possible, but peace at any rate till the short remainder of his own days had spun itself out. Mr Harding required not only success and peace, but he also demanded that he might stand justified before the world. The bishop, however, was comparatively easy to deal with, and before the arrival of the other, the dutiful son had persuaded his father that all was going on well, and then the warden arrived. It was Mr Harding's wont, whenever he spent a morning at the palace, to seat himself immediately at the bishop's elbow, the bishop occupying a huge arm-chair fitted up with candlesticks, a reading table, a drawer, and other paraphernalia, the position of which chair was never moved, summer or winter. And when, as was usual, the archdeacon was there also, he confronted the two elders, who thus were enabled to fight the battle against him together, and together submit to defeat, for such was their constant fate. Our warden now took his accustomed place, having greeted his son-in-law as he entered, and then affectionately inquired after his friend's health. There was a gentleness about the bishop to which the soft womanly affection of Mr Harding particularly endeared itself, and it was quaint to see how the two mild old priests pressed each other's hand, and smiled, and made little signs of love. "Sir Abraham's opinion has come at last," began the archdeacon. "Mr Harding had heard so much, and was most anxious to know the result. "It is quite favourable," said the bishop, pressing his friend's arm. "I am so glad." Mr Harding looked at the mighty bearer of the important news for confirmation of these glad tidings. "Yes," said the archdeacon, "Sir Abraham has given most minute attention to the case. Indeed, I knew he would. Most minute attention. And his opinion is, and as to his opinion on such a subject being correct, no one who knows Sir Abraham's character can doubt. His opinion is that they haven't got a leg to stand on." "But as how, archdeacon?" "Why, in the first place, but you're no lawyer, warden, and I doubt you won't understand it. The gist of the matter is this: under Hiram's will, 2 paid guardians have been selected for the hospital. The law will say 2 paid servants, and you and I won't quarrel with the name. At any rate, I will not, if I am one of the servants," said Mr Harding. "A rose, you know—" "Yes, yes," said the archdeacon, impatient of poetry at such a time. "Well, 2 paid servants, we'll say, one to look after the men, and the other to look after the money. You and Chadwick are these 2 servants, and whether either of you be paid too much or too little, more or less, in fact, than the founder willed, it's as clear as daylight that no one can fall foul of either of you for receiving an allotted stipend." "That does seem clear," said the bishop, who had winced visibly at the words servants and stipend, which, however, appeared to have caused no uneasiness to the archdeacon. "Quite clear," said he, "and very satisfactory. In point of fact, it being necessary to select such servants for the use of the hospital, the pay to be given to them must depend on the rate of pay for such services, according to their market value at the period in question, and those who manage the hospital must be the only judges of this." "And who does manage the hospital?" asked the warden. "Oh, let them find that out. That's another question. The action is brought against you and Chadwick. That's your defence, and a perfect and full defence it is. Now that I think very satisfactory." "Well," said the bishop, looking inquiringly up into his friend's face, who sat silent a while, and apparently not so well satisfied. "And conclusive," continued the archdeacon. "If they press it to a jury, which they won't do, no 12 men in England will take 5 minutes to decide against them." "But according to that," said Mr Harding, "I might as well have 1600 a year as 8, if the managers choose to allot it to me; and as I am one of the managers, if not the chief manager myself, that can hardly be a just arrangement." "Oh, well, all that's nothing to the question. The question is, whether this intruding fellow and a lot of cheating attorneys and pestilent dissenters are to interfere with an arrangement which everyone knows is essentially just and serviceable to the church. Pray don't let us be splitting hairs, and that amongst ourselves, or there'll never be an end of the cause,
or the cost."
Mr Harding again sat silent for a while, during which the bishop once and again pressed his arm, and looked in his face to see if he could catch a gleam of a contented and eased mind; but there was no such gleam, and the poor warden continued playing sad dirges on invisible stringed instruments in all manner of positions. He was ruminating in his mind on this opinion of Sir Abraham, looking to it wearily and earnestly for satisfaction, but finding none. At last he said, "Did you see the opinion, archdeacon?"
The archdeacon said he had not; that was to say, he had; that was, he had not seen the opinion itself. He had seen what had been called a copy, but he could not say whether of a whole or part, nor could he say that what he had seen were the ipsissima verba of the great man himself. But what he had seen contained exactly the decision which he had announced, and which he again declared to be, to his mind, extremely satisfactory. "I should like to see the opinion," said the warden; "that is, a copy of it." "Well, I suppose you can, if you make a point of it, but I don't see the use myself. Of course it is essential that the purport of it should not be known, and it is therefore unadvisable to multiply copies."
"Why should it not be known?" asked the warden.
"What a question for a man to ask!" said the archdeacon, throwing up his hands in token of his surprise. "But it is like you. A child is not more innocent than you are in matters of business. Can't you see that if we tell them that no action will lie against you, but that one may possibly lie against some other person or persons, that we shall be putting weapons into their hands, and be teaching them how to cut our own throats?"
The warden again sat silent, and the bishop again looked at him wistfully.
"The only thing we have now to do," continued the archdeacon, "is to remain quiet, hold our peace, and let them play their own game as they please."
"We are not to make known, then," said the warden, "that we have consulted the attorney general, and that we are advised by him that the founder's will is fully and fairly carried out?"
"God bless my soul!" said the archdeacon, "how odd it is that you will not see that all we are to do is to do nothing. Why should we say anything about the founder's will? We are in possession, and we know that they are not in a position to put us out. Surely that is enough for the present."
Mr Harding rose from his seat and paced thoughtfully up and down the library, the bishop the while watching him painfully at every turn, and the archdeacon continuing to pour forth his convictions
that the affair was in a state to satisfy any prudent mind.
"And the Jupiter?" said the warden, stopping suddenly.
"Oh, the Jupiter!" answered the other. "The Jupiter can break no bones. You must bear with that. There is much, of course, which it is our bounden duty to bear. It cannot be all roses for us here."
And the archdeacon looked exceedingly moral.
"Besides, the matter is too trivial, of too little general interest, to be mentioned again in the Jupiter. unless we stir up the subject." And the archdeacon again looked exceedingly knowing and worldly wise. The warden continued his walk. The hard and stinging words of that newspaper article, each one of which had thrust a thorn, as it were, into his inmost soul, were fresh in his memory. He had read it more than once, word by word, and what was worse, he fancied it was as well known to every one as to himself. Was he to be looked on as the unjust, griping priest he had been there described? Was he to be pointed at as the consumer of the bread of the poor, and to be allowed no means of refuting such charges, of clearing his begrimed name, of standing innocent in the world, as hitherto he had stood? Was he to bear all this, to receive as usual his now hated income, and be known as one of those greedy priests who by their rapacity have brought disgrace on their church? And why should he bear all this? Why should he die, for he felt that he could not live under such a weight of obloquy? As he paced up and down the room, he resolved, in his misery and enthusiasm, that he could, with pleasure, if he were allowed, give up his place, abandon his pleasant home, leave the hospital, and live poorly, happily, and with an unsullied name, on the small remainder of his means. He was a man somewhat shy of speaking of himself, even before those who knew him best, and whom he loved the most. But at last it burst forth from him, and with a somewhat jerking eloquence he declared that he could not, would not bear this misery any longer. "If it can be proved," said he at last, "that I have a just and honest right to this, as God well knows I always deemed I had, if this salary or stipend be really my due, I am not less anxious than another to retain it. I have the well-being of my child to look to. I am too old to miss, without some pain, the comforts to which I have been used, and I am, as others are, anxious to prove to the world that I have been right, and to uphold the place I have held. But I cannot do it at such a cost as this. I cannot bear this. Could you tell me to do so?" And he appealed almost in tears to the bishop, who had left his chair and was now leaning on the warden's arm as he stood on the further side of the table facing the archdeacon. "Could you tell me to sit there at ease, indifferent and satisfied, while such things as these are said loudly of me in the world?" The bishop could feel for him and sympathize with him, but he could not advise him. He could only say, "No, no, you shall be asked to do nothing that is painful. You shall do just what your heart tells you to be right. You shall do whatever you think best yourself. Theophilus, don't advise him, pray don't advise the warden to do anything which is painful." But the archdeacon, though he could not sympathize, could advise, and he saw that the time had come when it behoved him to do so.
in a somewhat peremptory manner. "Why, my lord," he said, speaking to his father, and when he called his father "my lord," the good old bishop shook in his shoes, for he knew that an evil time was coming. "Why, my lord, there are two ways of giving advice. There is advice that may be good for the present day, and there is advice that may be good for days to come. Now, I cannot bring myself to give the former if it be incompatible with the other." "No, no, no, I suppose not," said the bishop, reseating himself, and shading his face with his hands. Mr Harding sat down with his back to the further wall, playing to himself some air fitted for so calamitous an occasion, and the archdeacon said out his say standing, with his back to the empty fireplace. "It is not to be supposed but that much pain will spring out of this unnecessarily raised question. We must all have foreseen that, and the matter has in no wise gone on worse than we expected; but it will be weak, yes, and wicked also, to abandon the cause and own ourselves wrong because the inquiry is painful. It is not only ourselves we have to look to a certain extent the interest of the church is in our keeping. Should it be found that one after another of those who hold preferment abandoned it whenever it might be attacked, is it not plain that such attacks would be renewed till nothing was left of us, and that if so deserted, the Church of England must fall to the ground altogether? If this be true of many, it is true of one. Were you, accused as you now are, to throw up the wardenship and to relinquish the preferment which is your property, with the vain object of proving yourself disinterested, you would fail in that object. You would inflict a desperate blow on your brother clergyman. You would encourage every cantankerous dissenter in England to make a similar charge against some source of clerical revenue, and you would do your best to dishearten those who are most anxious to defend you and uphold your position. I can fancy nothing more weak or more wrong. It is not that you think that there is any justice in these charges, or that you doubt your own right to the wardenship. You are convinced of your own honesty, and yet would yield to them through cowardice." "Cowardice!" said the bishop, expostulating. Mr Harding sat unmoved, gazing on his son-in-law. "Well, would it not be cowardice? Would he not do so because he is afraid to endure the evil things which will be falsely spoken of him? Would that not be cowardice? And now let us see the extent of the evil which you dread. The Jupiter publishes an article which a great many, no doubt, will read; but of those who understand the subject, how many will believe the Jupiter? Everyone knows what its object is. It has taken up the case against Lord Guildford, and against the Dean of Rochester, and that against half a dozen bishops. Does not everyone know that it would take up any case of the kind, right or wrong, false or true, with known justice or known injustice, if by doing so it could further its own views?
Does not all the world know this of the Jupiter? Who that really knows you will think the worse of you for what the Jupiter says? And why care for those who do not know you? I will say nothing of your own comfort, but I do say that you could not be justified in throwing up in a fit of passion, for such it would be, the only maintenance that Eleanor has; and if you did so, if you really did vacate the wardenship and submit to ruin, what would that profit you? If you have no future right to the income, you have had no past right to it, and the very fact of your abandoning your position would create a demand for repayment of that which you have already received and spent. The poor warden groaned as he sat perfectly still, looking up at the hard-hearted orator who thus tormented him, and the bishop echoed the sound faintly from behind his hands. But the archdeacon cared little for such signs of weakness, and completed his exhortation. But let us suppose the office to be left vacant, and that your own troubles concerning it were over. Would that satisfy you? Are your only aspirations in the matter confined to yourself and family? I know they are not. I know you are as anxious as any of us for the church to which we belong, and what a grievous blow would such an act of apostasy give her. You owe it to the church of which you are a member and a minister to bear with this affliction, however severe it may be. You owe it to my father, who instituted you, to support his rights. You owe it to those who preceded you to assert the legality of their position. You owe it to those who are to come after you, to maintain uninjured for them that which you received uninjured from others. And you owe to us all the unflinching assistance of perfect brotherhood in this matter, so that, upholding one another, we may support our great cause without blushing and without disgrace. And so the archdeacon ceased, and stood self-satisfied, watching the effect of his spoken wisdom. The warden felt himself to a certain extent stifled. He would have given the world to get himself out into the open air without speaking to or noticing those who were in the room with him. But this was impossible. He could not leave without saying something, and he felt himself confounded by the archdeacon's eloquence. There was a heavy, unfeeling, unanswerable truth in what he had said. There was so much practical but odious common sense in it, that he neither knew how to assent or to differ. If it were necessary for him to suffer, he felt that he could endure without complaint and without cowardice, providing that he was self-satisfied of the justice of his own cause. What he could not endure was that he should be accused by others and not acquitted by himself. Doubting, as he had begun to doubt, the justice of his own position in the hospital, he knew that his own self-confidence would not be restored because Mr. Bold had been in error as to some legal form, nor could he be satisfied to escape because through some legal fiction he who received the greatest benefit from the hospital might be considered only as one of its servants. The archdeacon's speech had silenced him, stupefied him, annihilated him, anything but satisfied him. With the bishop it fared not much better. He did not discern clearly how things were, but he saw enough to know that a battle was to be prepared for, a battle that would destroy his few remaining comforts and bring him with sorrow to the grave. The warden still sat and still looked at the archdeacon, till his thoughts fixed themselves wholly on the means of escape from his present position, and he felt like a bird fascinated by gazing on a snake. "I hope you agree with me," said the archdeacon at last, breaking the dread silence. "My lord, I hope you agree with me." Oh, what a sigh the bishop gave! "My lord, I hope you agree with me," again repeated the merciless tyrant. "Yes, I suppose so," groaned the poor old man slowly. "And you, warden?" Mr Harding was now stirred to action. He must speak and move, so he got up and took one turn before he answered. "Do not press me for an answer just at present. I will do nothing lightly in the matter, and of whatever I do I will give you and the bishop notice." And so, without another word, he took his leave, escaping quickly through the palace hall and down the lofty steps. Nor did he breathe freely till he found himself alone under the huge elms of the silent close. Here he walked long and slowly, thinking on his case with a troubled air, and trying in vain to confute the archdeacon's argument. He then went home, resolved to bear it all: ignominy, suspense, disgrace, self-doubt, and heart-burning, and to do as those would have him who he still believed were most fit and most able to counsel him aright. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 10 of The Warden, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom. Chapter 10. Tribulation. Mr Harding was a sadder man than he had ever yet been when he returned to his own house. He had been wretched enough on that well-remembered morning when he was forced to expose before his son-in-law the publisher's account for ushering into the world his dear book of sacred music, when, after making such payments as he could do unassisted, he found that he was a debtor of more than £300. But his sufferings then were as nothing to his present misery. Then he had done wrong, and he knew it, and was able to resolve that he would not sin in like manner again. But now he could make no resolution, and comfort himself by no promises of firmness. He had been forced to think that his lot had placed him in a false position, and he was about to maintain that position against the opinion of the world and against his own convictions. He had read with pity, amounting almost to horror, the strictures which had appeared from time to time against the Earl of Guildford as master of St Cross, and the invectives that had been heaped on rich diocesan dignitaries and overgrown sinecure pluralists. In judging of them, he judged leniently. The whole bias of his profession had taught him to think that they were more sinned against than sinning, and that the animosity with which they had been pursued was venomous and unjust. But he had not the less regarded their plight as most miserable. His hair had stood on end, and his flesh had crept, as he read the things which had been written. He had wondered how men could live under such a load of disgrace, how they could face their fellow creatures while their names were bandied about so injuriously and so publicly. And now this lot was to be his. He, that shy, retiring man, who had so comforted himself in the hidden obscurity of his lot, who had so enjoyed the unassuming warmth of his own little corner, he was now dragged forth into the glaring day, and gibbeted before ferocious multitudes. He entered his own house a crestfallen, humiliated man, without a hope of overcoming the wretchedness which affected him. He wandered into the drawing room where was his daughter, but he could not speak to her now, so he left it and went into the book room. He was not quick enough to escape Eleanor's glance, or to prevent her from seeing that he was disturbed, and in a little while she followed him. She found him seated in his accustomed chair, with no book open before him, no pen ready in his hand, no ill-shapen notes of blotted music lying before him as was usual, none of those hospital accounts with which he was so precise and yet so unmethodical. He was doing nothing, thinking of nothing, looking at nothing. He was merely suffering. "Leave me, Eleanor, my dear," he said. "Leave me, my darling, for a few minutes, for I am busy." Eleanor saw well how it was, but she did leave him, and glided silently back to her drawing room. When he had sat a while thus alone and unoccupied, he got up to walk again. He could make more of his thoughts walking than sitting, and was creeping out into his garden when he met Bunce on the threshold. "Well, Bunce," said he, in a tone that for him was sharp, "what is it? Do you want me?" "I was only coming to ask after your reverence," said the old bedesman, touching his hat, "and to inquire about the news from London," he added, after a pause. The warden winced, and put his hand to his forehead, and felt bewildered. "Attorney Finney has been there this morning," continued Bunce, "and by his looks I guess he is not so well pleased as he once was, and it has got abroad somehow that the archdeacon has had down great news from London, and Handy and Moody are both as black as devils. And I hope," said the man, trying to assume a cheery tone, "that things are looking up, and that there'll be an end soon to all this stuff which bothers your reverence so sorely." "Well, I wish there may be, Bunce." "But about the news, your reverence?" said the old man, almost whispering. Mr Harding walked on and shook his head impatiently. Poor Bunce little knew how he was tormenting his patron. "If there was anything to cheer you, I should be so glad to know it," said he, with a tone of affection which the warden in all his misery could not resist. He stopped,
and took both the old man's hands in his. "My friend," said he, "my dear old friend, there is nothing, there is no news to cheer me. God's will be done." And two small hot tears broke away from his eyes and stole down his furrowed cheeks. "Then God's will be done," said the other solemnly. "But they told me that there was good news from London, and I came to wish your reverence joy. But God's will be done." And so the warden again walked on, and the bedesman, looking wistfully after him, and receiving no encouragement to follow, returned sadly to his own abode. For a couple of hours the warden remained thus in the garden, now walking, now standing motionless on the turf, and then, as his legs got weary, sitting unconsciously on the garden seats, and then walking again; and Eleanor, hidden behind the muslin curtains of the window, watched him through the trees as he now came in sight, and then again was concealed by the turnings of the walk; and thus the time passed away till 5, when the warden crept back to the house and prepared for dinner. It was but a sorry meal. The demure parlour maid, as she handed the dishes and changed the plates, saw that all was not right, and was more demure than ever. Neither father nor daughter could eat, and the hateful food was soon cleared away, and the bottle of port placed upon the table. "Would you like Bunce to come in, papa?" said Eleanor, thinking that the company of the old man might lighten his sorrow. "No, my dear, thank you, not to day. But are not you going out, Eleanor, this lovely afternoon? Don't stay in for me, my dear." "I thought you seemed so sad, papa." "Sad!" said he, irritated. "Well, people must all have their share of sadness here. I am not more exempt than another. But kiss me, dearest, and go now. I will, if possible, be more sociable when you return." And Eleanor was again banished from her father's sorrow. Ah, her desire now was not to find him happy, but to be allowed to share his sorrows; not to force him to be sociable, but to persuade him to be trustful. She put on her bonnet as desired, and went up to Mary Bold. This was now her daily haunt, for John Bold was up in London among lawyers and church reformers, diving deep into other questions than that of the wardenship of Barchester, supplying information to one member of Parliament, and dining with another, subscribing to funds for the abolition of clerical incomes, and seconding, at that great national meeting at the Crown and Anchor, a resolution to the effect that no clergyman of the Church of England, be he who he might, should have more than 1,000 a year, and none less than 250. His speech on this occasion was short, for 15 had to speak, and the room was hired for 2 hours only, at the expiration of which the Quakers and Mr. Cobden were to make use of it for an appeal to the public in aid of the Emperor of Russia. But it was sharp and effective; at least he was told so by a companion with whom he now lived much, and on whom he greatly depended, one Tom Towers, a very leading genius, and supposed to have high employment on the staff of the Jupiter. So Eleanor, as was now her wont, went up to Mary Bold, and Mary listened kindly while the daughter spoke much of her father, and perhaps kinder still found a listener in Eleanor while she spoke about her brother. In the meantime the warden sat alone, leaning on the arm of his chair.
He had poured out a glass of wine, but had done so merely from habit, for he left it untouched. There he sat gazing at the open window, and thinking, if he can be said to have thought, of the happiness of his past life. All manner of past delights came before his mind, which at the time he had enjoyed without considering them. His easy days, his absence of all kind of hard work, his pleasant shady home, those 12 old neighbours whose welfare till now had been the source of so much pleasant care, the excellence of his children, the friendship of the dear old bishop, the solemn grandeur of those vaulted aisles through which he loved to hear his own voice pealing, and then that friend of friends, that choice ally that had never deserted him, that eloquent companion that would always, when asked, discourse such pleasant music, that violoncello of his. Ah, how happy he had been! But it was over now. His easy days and absence of work had been the crime which brought on him his tribulation. His shady home was pleasant no longer. Maybe it was no longer his. The old neighbours, whose welfare had been so desired by him, were his enemies. His daughter was as wretched as himself, and even the bishop was made miserable by his position. He could never again lift up his voice boldly as he had hitherto done among his brethren, for he felt that he was disgraced, and he feared even to touch his bow, for he knew how grievous a sound of wailing, how piteous a lamentation it would produce. He was still sitting in the same chair and the same posture, having hardly moved a limb for 2 hours, when Eleanor came back to tea, and succeeded in bringing him with her into the drawing room. The tea seemed as comfortless as the dinner, though the warden, who had hitherto eaten nothing all day, devoured the plateful of bread and butter, unconscious of what he was doing. Eleanor had made up her mind to force him to talk to her, but she hardly knew how to commence. She must wait till the urn was gone, till the servant would no longer be coming in and out. At last everything was gone, and the drawing room door was permanently closed. Then Eleanor, getting up and going round to her father, put her arm round his neck and said, "Papa, won't you tell me what it is?" What is, my dear?" "This new sorrow that torments you. I know you are unhappy, papa." "New sorrow? It's no new sorrow, my dear. We have all our cares sometimes." And he tried to smile, but it was a ghastly failure. "But I shouldn't be so dull a companion. Come, we'll have some music." "No, papa, not tonight. It would only trouble you tonight." And she sat upon his knee, as she sometimes would in their gayest moods, and with her arm round his neck she said, "Papa, I will not leave you till you talk to me. Oh, if you only knew how much good it would do to you to tell me of it all." The father kissed his daughter and pressed her to his heart, but still he said nothing. It was so hard to him to speak of his own sorrows. He was so shy a man, even with his own child. "Oh, papa, do tell me what it is. I know it is about the hospital, and what they are doing up in London, and what that cruel newspaper has said; but if there be such cause for sorrow, let us be sorrowful together. We are all in all to each other now. Dear, dear papa, do speak to me." Mr Harding could not well speak now, for the warm tears were running down his cheeks like rain in May; but he held his child close to his heart, and squeezed her hand as a lover might, and she kissed his forehead and his wet cheeks, and lay upon his bosom, and comforted him as a woman only can do. "My own child," he said, as soon as his tears would let him speak, "my own child, why should you too be unhappy before it is necessary? It may come to that we must leave this place, but till that time comes, why should your young days be clouded?" "And is that all, papa? If that be all, let us leave it, and have light hearts elsewhere. If that be all, let us go. Oh, papa, you and I could be happy if we had only bread to eat, so long as our hearts were light." And Eleanor's face was lighted up with enthusiasm, as she told her father how he might banish all his care, and a gleam of joy shot across his brow as this idea of escape again presented itself, and he again fancied for a moment that he could spurn away from him the income which the world envied him, that he could give the lie to that wielder of the tomahawk who had dared to write such things of him in the Jupiter, that he could leave Sir Abraham and the archdeacon and Bold and the rest of them, with their lawsuit among them, and wipe his hands altogether of so sorrow stirring a concern. Ah, what happiness might there be in the distance, with Eleanor and him in some small cottage, and nothing left of their former grandeur but their music! Yes, they would walk forth with their music books and their instruments, and shaking the dust from off their feet as they went, leave the ungrateful place. Never did a poor clergyman sigh for a warm benefice more anxiously than our warden did now to be rid of his. "Give it up, papa," she said again, jumping from his knees and standing on her feet before him, looking boldly into his face. "Give it up, papa." Oh, it was sad to see how that momentary gleam of joy passed away, how the look of hope was dispersed from that sorrowful face, as the remembrance of the archdeacon came back upon our poor warden, and he reflected that he could not stir from his now hated post. He was as a man bound with iron, fettered with adamant. He was in no respect a free agent. He had no choice. Give it up! Oh, if he only could! What an easy way that were out of all his troubles! "Papa, don't doubt about it," she continued, thinking that his hesitation arose from his unwillingness to abandon so comfortable a home. "Is it on my account that you would stay here? Do you think that I cannot be happy without a pony carriage and a fine drawing room? Papa, I never can be happy here as long as there is a question as to your honour in staying here; but I could be gay as the day is long in the smallest tiny little cottage, if I could see you come in and go out with a light heart. Oh, papa, your face tells so much. Though you won't speak to me with your voice, I know how it is with you every time I look at you." How he pressed her to his heart again with almost a spasmodic pressure! How he kissed her as the tears fell like rain from his old eyes! How he blessed her, and called her by 100 soft sweet names, which now came new to his lips! How he chid himself for ever having been unhappy with such a treasure in his house, such a jewel on his bosom, with so sweet a flower in the choice garden of his heart! And then the floodgates of his tongue were loosed, and at length, with unsparing detail of circumstances, he told her all that he wished and all that he could not do. He repeated those arguments of the archdeacon, not agreeing in their truth, but explaining his inability to escape from them; how it had been declared to him that he was bound to remain where he was by the interests of his order, by gratitude to the bishop, by the wishes of his friends, by a sense of duty, which, though he could not understand it, he was fain to acknowledge. He told her how he had been accused of cowardice, and though he was not a man to make much of such a charge before the world, now, in the full candour of his heart, he explained to her that such an accusation was grievous to him, that he did think it would be unmanly to desert his post merely to escape his present sufferings, and that therefore he must bear as best he might the misery which was prepared for him. And did she find these details tedious? Oh no! She encouraged him to dilate on every feeling he expressed, till he laid bare the inmost corners of his heart to her. They spoke together of the archdeacon as two children might of a stern, unpopular, but still respected schoolmaster, and of the bishop as a parent, kind as kind could be, but powerless against an omnipotent pedagogue. And then, when they had discussed all this, when the father had told all to the child, she could not be less confiding than he had been; and as John Bold's name was mentioned between them, she owned how well she had learnt to love him, had loved him once, she said, but she would not, could not do so now. No, even had her troth been plighted to him, she would have taken it back again. Had she sworn to love him as his wife, she would have discarded him, and not felt herself forsworn when he proved himself the enemy of her father. But the warden declared that Bold was no enemy of his, and encouraged her love, and gently rebuked, as he kissed her, the stern resolve she had made to cast him off. And then he spoke to her of happier days, when their trials would all be over, and declared that her young heart should not be torn asunder to please either priest or prelate, dean or archdeacon; no, not if all Oxford were to convocate together and agree as to the necessity of the sacrifice. And so they greatly comforted each other; and in what sorrow will not such mutual confidence give consolation? And with a last expression of tender love they parted, and went, comparatively happy, to their rooms. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Nick Whitley, Purley, United Kingdom.